If you would, please turn your Bibles open to Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, that's where we're going to start this morning. This morning, I want to talk about the fear of the Lord. And even this phrase within itself, I think, is something that we have mixed emotions about. Take something like fear, right? Fear is something that you want to push away. It's scary things. It's not something you want to interact with. The things that you are afraid of, you don't like. But then you have the Lord. The Lord that hopefully where you're at is that you want to embrace the Lord. You want to have a relationship with Him. You want to have closeness. And so how do you take these two ideas that seem so separate, seem like contrasts, and you put them together? How do you do this in a biblical way? And so that's what I want to explore this morning. And I think there's a series of passages within the book of Mark that help us to explore this tension and this idea that why would I want to fear the Lord? Why should I? And so there's different elements to this. There's different elements to the fear of the Lord that I want to explore. And those elements are knowing the fear of the Lord. How should we interact with the fear of the Lord, and how are we actually going to be comforted by the fear of the Lord? And so the first story that I want to explore is at the end of Mark 4. And I'm not going to read every passage that we're going to talk about this morning, but I do want to read this first one in its totality. So starting in verse 35, it says this: "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us go to the other side.' And leaving the crowds, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?' And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, 'Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?' And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Jesus tells his disciples, "Let us go to the other side." And they all get in their boats, and they're making their way across this sea. And then there's a storm. And you got to understand that the people in this boat, they're used to being on the water. That it's not just a storm that maybe you and me would be afraid of. This is a storm that is terrifying to career fishermen, to people like Andrew and Peter and James and John, people that had their own fishing businesses. And this storm was overwhelming and terrifying to them. That there was water filling in this boat, and they didn't know what to do. And where do you find Jesus? Jesus is asleep in the stern, on the cushion. And they go to Jesus and they start shaking. They're, wake up, wake up. Do you not understand that we're perishing? Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" And they wake him up. And I don't know how you are when you wake up from a nap. If you wake me up from a nap, you can ask Rob, you can ask my mom. If you wake me up from a nap, like if I'm like in a good nap, I cannot function. I'm not there. I'm just disoriented. I'm trying my best. But if you wake me up from a good nap, I'm not there. But Jesus, he wakes up from his sleep. And he says, "Peace, be still." And the waters just cease. And I want you to imagine what this would be like to be a disciple. But maybe you're not used to like hurricanes or like sea storms. You don't spend that much time on the water, but it's Bowling Green. So we get a storm of some type, a tornado, those are pretty common here. And some of you have intimate experience, more experience than you would want with those things. And so I want you to imagine that you're going down Scottsville Road, and you're in your car, and you see this tornado barreling towards you. And Jesus, he's asleep in your passenger seat, and he's taking a nap. And you're freaking out because you see this tornado get closer and closer, and you start waking up Jesus, and you're like, "Jesus, please wake up. There's this storm. Like we're in trouble." And Jesus wakes up, and he just says, "Stop." And the tornado ceases to be. how would you feel in that moment? I think part of you would go, okay, great, like the storm's not going to kill me now. This is great. Like I'm in safety. But I think there's going to be a different part of you in this equation as well. See, Jesus, he rebukes the storm. He rebukes the waves, but then he turns and he rebukes the disciples. Do you notice that? That in verse 39, he rebukes the wind and it ceases, and then he rebukes them in verse 40. And he says, "Why are you so afraid? Why are you afraid of this storm? Do you still not have faith in me? You've been with me now for a while. Why are you so afraid?" But what's interesting is this next verse. In verse 41, "And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, not, 'Oh, what a great storm that was,' but instead, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Mind you, that's something that only God can do in the Old Testament. If you know in Genesis 1 that the sea is parted, that's something God does. In Exodus 14, when they're crossing the Red Sea, that's something God does. When they're crossing in through the Jordan, that's something that God does. And so this is something only God can do, but yet Jesus does it. And so imagine being in that car. And you see that tornado, and you are scared out of your mind that this tornado is coming towards you. But when Jesus says, "Just be still," and the tornado stops, what are you afraid of now? That the focus of their fear is no longer on the storm and what was. It's no longer on the tornado, but it's on who's in the boat with them. It's on who's in the car with them. Who is this person that can do things that only God is able to do? And so I think this is where we need to start. That the equation, this tension, this process is not to say you don't need to fear the Lord. That fearing the Lord is wrong and that you should take that out of your heart. Actually, throughout the Bible, in the whole narrative of the Bible, the fear of the Lord is something associated with wisdom. And not having the fear of the Lord is something associated with wickedness and foolishness. That the one that we serve is God, and He has power. Power over things like great storms, and power over much more, as we'll see as we continue in this lesson. That you need to be sober-minded about the power that the Lord has. And that when you approach Him, you need to approach that with respectful and reverent fear. But that makes us uncomfortable. It does. Because again, some of the things that I've already said, but even our experience with those that have power is uncomfortable. We see that when world leaders, they get power, it corrupts them, and they do things that are selfish in manner. We see that when people in our workplace, they get power, they also are corrupted and use it in ways that aren't right. And maybe even within our homes, we see that. That those that have power use it unfairly and unjustly. And so the question is, not only do we understand the fear of the Lord and know that, but do we understand the one who holds that power? Do we understand the character of Jesus and how He's going to use this power? And so the next two stories that I want to look at in the book of Mark are going to explore this idea. How do we interact with the fear of the Lord? And how will interacting with the fear of the Lord actually help us to understand Jesus better? And we're going to look at this first story that's going to do that incorrectly. These people are not going to interact with the fear of the Lord correctly. And then we're going to see a story where someone does. So at the beginning of Mark 5, they get to the other side of the sea, just as Jesus had promised earlier. They get to the other side of the sea, but notice in verse 2, "And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit." And maybe everyone gets out of the boat, but maybe Jesus is the only one getting out of the boat. And you'd be asking yourself, why would that be? Why would it just be maybe Jesus getting out of the boat? Well, the region they're in is a Gentile region. It's an unclean region. And this man running towards them is an unclean man in many, many ways. And so we see that this man, he actually lives among the tombs. And so if we put ourselves back into this position of the car on Scottsville, somehow we get on Cemetery Road, and then we stop at the cemetery, and we get out, and Jesus just gets out, and there's just this man that's sprinting towards Jesus. And this man, as he's talking with Jesus, there's some things that we find out through the text and through what he says. So he lives among the tombs, that he's cutting himself, and he's bleeding, and that the people of the town have tried to restrain him before with shackles and with chains, but every time they try, he just breaks the shackles. He has superhuman strength of some sort. And how is that able to happen? Well, it's because he has demon-possessed. He has this unclean spirit. And not only is it one demon, but when Jesus asks him in verse 9, "What is your name?" he replies, "My name is Legion, for we are many." In the Roman military, a legion was 5,600 men to 6,000 men. There's some variance on how people see that. And so it's around 6,000. I'll just take it to the whole number. So imagine maybe this man has what would be 6,000 demons within him. And so he has uncleanness in every regard. He's a Gentile. He's cutting himself, which would be unclean under the old law, having and exposing yourself to blood. There would be this uncleanness of being among dead bodies and being among the tomb. There's just so much uncleanness about him, but yet Jesus still interacted with this man. And not only did he interact with him, but he actually had mercy on this man. And he sends the demons out of him. And he sends these demons into a group of pigs, around 2,000 pigs. And they all go and drown themselves. And the herdsmen, the people looking after the pigs, they go back into the town. And they say, "Guys, you got to come. You got to come check out what's happening out here. All our pigs are dead." So pick up in verse 14. "And the herdsmen fled and told it into the city and the country, and people came to see what had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there clothed in his right mind. And they were joyous, and they were so excited about this man who finally, they've been trying everything to help him, and that nothing worked, and they were joyous that he's finally in his right mind. But instead, that's not what the text says at all. And they were afraid. They see this man in his right mind, and they were terrified." In verse 16, "And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region." These people, these herdsmen, this town, whoever was there, they understood the fear of the Lord. They understood the power. They saw it in real time. They saw a man that they couldn't control, that they couldn't bind, and somehow this guy, Jesus, is able to do that. But they were missing something. They were missing understanding the character of Jesus. They were missing the understanding of who he was in his person and in his character. See, what they were missing was what it says in verse 19. "And he did not permit him," that means being the man who was demon-possessed, "and said to him, 'Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you.'" They saw the power and they saw what Jesus was able to do, but they didn't see what Jesus used that power to do. That Jesus used his power to enter into this place of uncleanness to rescue this man. To rescue this man from his struggles and his burden. That's the character of Jesus. And they completely missed that. They missed the fact that Jesus had mercy and cared for this man when everyone else had given up on him, and saw him more valuable than 2,000 pigs. And so this is the incorrect way to understand the fear of the Lord. That if I just have fear of the Lord, but I do not have faith in him, that leads me to reject him and to push him out of my life. And so we need to make sure that we're not like this. That yes, I'm seeing that the Lord is powerful, and I need to see that. But I'm also seeing what He uses that powerful and how merciful He is. And there's a woman that comes right after this story who sees this. And her story is interesting in how the book of Mark is laid out. Because if you notice in verses 21 through 24, there's one story, and then it switches to this woman's story, and then it goes back to the man's story. So there's this guy named Jairus or Jairus, or there's many different ways to pronounce it. That guy's story is kind of a sandwich, and then the meat in the middle would be this woman's story. This woman who has this bleeding for 12 years. And so Jairus, he comes up to this woman, he comes up to Jesus, sorry. So Jairus comes up to Jesus, this ruler of the synagogue, and he says, my daughter is at the point of death. Please come with me so that as she is made well. And as Jesus is following this man on this journey, as Jesus is going towards this little girl who's on the brink of death, there's this woman. And this woman has been bleeding for 12 years. And to kind of give you context of what that would mean for her life is that she would be considered unclean. And so she wouldn't be able to interact with her friends or her family for 12 years. And this woman was suffering. And she'd gone to this doctor and that doctor, and she was just searching for an answer, but every time and every treatment seemed to just make things worse. I don't know your experience with people with medical complexities, things that they're trying to figure out that they don't really have a solution to. Sometimes the struggle in that is not the illness or the sickness within itself, but the fact that they can't find the answer to what is even going on or how to make it better. There's no hope or direction in their situation, and that's where this woman's at. So she has this thing that's affecting her socially, it's affecting her probably physically, and it's also probably affecting her emotionally and mentally. That I have no hope in this situation. But in verse 27, she had heard reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And in Matthew's account of the situation, it says the fringe of his garments. And some people would take that to mean like the tassels at the end of his tunic. And so he'd be wearing a tunic, and there would be these strings at the end of their tunics, something that Jews would wear to remind them of obeying the law of God and things like that. And so imagine this situation very much could be that there's people surrounding and touching Jesus all over, and she's on the ground trying to crawl and reach out and just swipe and barely touch the fringe of his garment. And she has the faith to know that if I even just barely nick one of those tassels, I'll be made well. Jesus perceives in himself that the power has gone out of him. And he asks an interesting question, who touched my garments? And the disciples in verse 31, they think this is an interesting question. They say, you see the crowd pressing around you, yet you say, who touched me? Jesus, you have people touching you you're in a crowd. Like everyone's touching you. What do you mean, who touched me? And he looked around in verse 32 to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him, told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. The difference between this woman and the people that we saw at the beginning of chapter 5 is not that this woman didn't have fear and these people did. They both had fear, but this woman also had faith. This woman had the type of faith to know that he has the power, and I know that he has the character to show mercy. And so I'm going to reach past the crowd and through the crowd so that I can just maybe barely touch him, and there will be healing from that, and there will be meaning from that. And that should be where we are at. This is how we need to interact with the fear of the Lord. Not the fear of the Lord only, but instead the fear of the Lord with faith. Those two things together. And not only does this lead to healing in our lives and a relationship with the Lord and proper understanding of these things, but this last story shows us how this actually gives us comfort. To know the power and the fear of the Lord and also the character with which He has. In verse 35, we get back to this guy named Jairus. So remember, at the beginning, in the sandwich situation, he has a daughter. She's at the brink of death. He says, Jesus, please come with me. Jesus comes with him. Jesus stops, interacts with this woman that's been bleeding for 12 years. And in verse 35, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? I want you to imagine being this man. Your child is at the brink of death. They're almost gone. And in your hope, and you go to Jesus and you say, Jesus, please come with me. And he stops for this woman that's been bleeding for 12 years. In an emergency room situation, there's something called triage in healthcare. And let's say you have someone who has had maybe this chronic issue. Let's say they've been bleeding for 12 years. And it's not a great situation, and they're suffering, and you need to address that. But then you have someone come in from, let's say, a car accident, and they're about to die if you don't immediately address that situation. You prioritize that situation over the other one. But that's not what Jesus does here. Jesus does not prioritize what would seem to be the higher triage situation, the thing that needs to be addressed first. And I think he does this for a reason. He was trying to show this man something. He was trying to show this man that you need to have the mindset and the faith that this woman has if you want me to do what I'm about to do. Because Jesus says in verse 36, overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. But Dylan, I thought you said that we need to fear the Lord, and that's a good thing. What is he saying not to fear? What has just been told to him? Your daughter is dead. You don't need to fear death. You don't need to fear what has just happened to your daughter. You only need to believe in me. You need to have the type of faith that this woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years and came and was crawling and trying to swipe at my garment, you need to have that type of faith in me. But you don't need to fear death. See, death is the ultimate problem. It's something that deep down we all fear. And before Jesus, there wasn't a solution to it. You die. And we still fear this thing of death. We fear our interaction with it. We fear when our loved ones go through it. We fear death. And what Jesus is saying is that he is more powerful than death. That he has power over death. And he comes to this little girl. He comes in the house, and there's people that are literally mourning and literally lamenting inside the house. He says, she's not dead. And they laugh at him. What do you mean, Jesus? She's dead. He says, everyone get out, but the mother, the father, and 3 of my disciples. And he says to this little girl in Aramaic, his native language, little girl, I say to you, arise. In verse 42, and immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. With Jesus, death is only sleep. This is how it's talked about in the New Testament for believers, that they are just sleeping. And in John 11, there's some confusion about that. The disciples are like, then he'll be restored if he's just sleeping. And then Jesus is like, no, he's actually dead. And so it's not taking away the fact that that happens. It's saying because of Jesus that this will only be a moment. Just like you go to bed at night, you will wake up in the morning. And there is going to be a morning. And there's going to be someone, there is a God who is powerful enough to overcome death. And this is the comfort and this is the pleasure of having fear of the Lord. Because I know He's powerful. I know He's powerful enough to calm storms that even sailors can't calm and overcome. I know that He is powerful enough to bind demons that no one else can bind. I know that He is powerful enough to heal sicknesses that no other doctor can heal. And I know that He is powerful enough to overcome the deepest problem and the deepest fear we all face, death. And I know that He has the character to extend mercy upon me, and that He is going to use this power not selfishly, but instead as a servant for others. This was the scripture reading that we read before the lesson. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, He Himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death He might destroy the one who has power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. That Jesus has freed us not only from death, not only from sin, but of fear of death. This no longer has to be something we fear, but that's something that we know Jesus can conquer. And on top of that, there's this passage in 1 John 4 that doesn't talk about first death, but second death. That when we are raised, there will be a judgment. And those that are on one side of those things will come and have an embracement and a life or an eternity alongside God, and on the other side of those things, there will be punishment. But those that are in Christ, it says this about. So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment. Because as He is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. Because I fear the Lord, I don't have to fear death anymore. Because I fear the Lord, I don't have to fear judgment. Because I am with Christ, and He will conquer. I hope this has been helpful to understanding the fear of the Lord in a biblical way. I want to leave you with two things that I urge you to do, and I hope you understand. Is that this is a way that you walk in your life. Knowing that you have a warrior on your side that's able to overcome all these things, even the greatest of battles. And that gives you boldness and confidence in what you know you need to do. That this is how the church is described in Acts 9, early on. That they were walking in the fear of the Lord and the comfort of the Holy Spirit, and it was multiplying. That if we're understanding and living in this way, that the church, not the number here, but those that are with Christ and connected to Him, will be multiplied and will grow. Because this fear of the Lord, as it's described in 2 Corinthians 5, knowing the fear of the Lord will push us to persuade others to come and join us in this walk. This is an important and a powerful thing. Maybe you have not come to know the Lord. You don't know His character. You don't know why you should fear Him. You don't know Jesus. And you would like to know Him more. I would love to talk to you about that. I know that there's others here that would as well. Or maybe lately, your relationship with God, or maybe the whole time, your relationship with God has been misunderstood. That I've never treated the Lord with the proper fear and reverence that He deserves. I have never treated Him as one that is powerful, but one that does what I want Him to do. Or maybe you're on the other side of this, that I've had an immense fear of the Lord, fear that is like the herdsmen that are trying to push Jesus away because I don't understand the character of God. And I'd love prayers of encouragement. I would love help in understanding that. Whatever your need, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.